Hi, my name is Jim Cheshire. I'm a member of the philosophy department and here to welcome you to our philosophy department faculty colloquium. It's a new series sponsored by the philosophy department and the Center for Philosophical Education, which is basically led by our executive director and my immediate supervisor, Joseph White. It's nice to see everyone here, and I'd like to offer a special welcome to members of the community who've come off campus, not to diminish the presence of our students and faculty, but it's wonderful to have community people here. We've had 4 lectures, I believe, 3. There will be 4 altogether. Henry Baggish, Manu Eskandari, I gave a lecture last time, and this will be our last. We had scheduled 5, but had to cancel the last one. So if you have that on your calendar, please make the correction. Let's see. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Curtis Solberg address us. Professor Solberg finished his PhD at UCSB. I believe he also did his bachelor's degree and master's degree there. Has been teaching at Santa Barbara City College since 1965 and has also taught at 2 other universities. And in addition to that, when he had the time, has published some research. Also as a member of our distinguished group of faculty lecturers here at Santa Barbara City College. So I think you're in for quite a treat. Today he will be addressing the topic Generation X, that's some of you I suppose, American Democracy in the 21st Century, Seeking Clarity from History. So please help me welcome Professor Solberg.
Am I wired? I'm wired. Well, first of all, thank you for letting me participate in this lecture series. I don't know if he's here today or not, but I should mention the godfather of the philosophy department, now Professor Emeritus, but he's behind this series and he's helped arrange it, and although he's retired, he's very much involved with the philosophy department. And Dr. Peter Angelis, are you here? No. Joe, he's not here. I wanted to mention him, Joe, anyway. Secondly, the topic today is politics. And that makes me nervous because I'm an insecure type guy. I'm very insecure because, you know, if I say something and I say it in an incorrect way, I might be in trouble. So I want to assure you that I'm subversive, I'm not dangerous. I'm really an all-American guy. I'm all-American from tip to toe. I'm an all-American guy. I'm a true blue American. I've got to tell you about the garment. You wouldn't believe my wife. My wife is such a model wife. She works so hard, at home and elsewhere. And in the evening, you know, we are just side by side. And I could have gone to Kmart and gotten exactly, you know, that kind of V-neck for $9.50, made in Thailand. But oh no globalization in our household. She put in 2 score of hours, night after night. We were side by side. It was a homely scene. It was an all-American scene. We had the glass of Mendocino Red. We had the early Stones. We had the Cat Stevens. And she finished the sweater just last night because she wanted me to wear it to make my ensemble complete. I'm an all-American guy. Now, I didn't want to talk about sex. But you know, facing an ornery audience like this, you got to expect anything, and particularly with the impudence of the younger generation, I fully expect a question along the lines of, does my underwear color coordinate? But I'm not going to go there. Americans seem to have an obsession with things related to the boudoir. Sex, clothing, underwear, lingerie. Let me give you an example. By the way, do we have just a couple minutes for just a couple of rounds of College Whiz Kid Bowl? Yes or no? Okay. Here's the first question. Now, this is a question. This is a question for anyone whose political memory, well, I suppose anybody who is age 25 is eligible to raise their hand and answer this question. Now, this has to do with the world of undergarments. Okay, now, in the lifespan of a 25-year-old, when did underwear appear prominently in the current political scene? Go ahead. Yes. What happened? Do you remember what kind that was? You got it. Fruit of the Loom, that's right. Okay. Okay. Now, the next question in College Whiz Kid Bowl is only for people in this room whose political memories go back 50 years. Now, this is a tough one, but I have confidence in the seniors in this room. Here's my question. How did lingerie become a hot-burning political issue in American politics around 1950? I can't hear you. No. Dr. Kelly, 1950 about? I know you do, sir. I know you do. Wow, Dr. Kelly, Frank Kelly. I'm really surprised. Well, okay, I'll give you guys a hint. Sophists, maybe you know. We're talking a campaign that involved a woman candidate in Southern California. I'm sorry? Oh, hell. Whom was she running against? And who was his opponent? Helen Gahagan Douglas, the wife of the actor Melvin Douglas. And Harold, now that we're on track, what did Nixon say about his opponent in that election race?
He said that you shouldn't elect her.
Well, here's the point. Given the climate of the Red Scare, Nixon charged that his opponent was pink right down to her underwear. But I'm not going to go there. I promised her I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do the song and dance routine. I wouldn't do the Viking helmet. I wouldn't do an imitation of God. Please forgive me. I wouldn't do any of those things. I decided that today it's just going to be straightforward. And all I'm going to do is to read a paper. Because, here's why. Two inspirations. Last month, Professor Cheshire decided to read a paper. What a smart idea. It was so efficient. It was the model of lucidity and clarity, exploring really profound questions like, you dig this, who are we, philosophically? And the paper was a good way to go. Secondly, it reminded me very fondly of the 1950s when I was an undergraduate university, and the Student History Club sponsored reading papers contest for undergraduates. And they could, assemble and read their paper, and 20 or 40 or 50 students would listen. It was kind of an exhilarating experience, kind of intellectual. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to read a paper, and by the way, I'm an old-fashioned kind of a guy, and as you know, I need a chalkboard, so Shall we go for it? Chalkboard. I have to explain this. I have an inordinate pride in this chalkboard. As you know, for 37 years I've been here, and I've clearly ossified into a Neanderthal-type person whose bag of tricks relies exclusively on a piece of chalk and an occasional map. But today I decided I will go high-tech. I figured that if Dr. McDougall can do it, PowerPoint I mean, then maybe I can too. So with the help of Gloria Baltz, who, it's one of these people whom you don't hear about, but Gloria is my guardian angel this week because she's the one who really did this for me. She arranged my chalkboard. I've decided to go that way, and I have my chalkboard, and as I present my ideas, I'll be mindful that some students may wish to catch the essence of my remarks in their notes. So as far as you guys and gals are concerned, I'll keep you in mind as I lay out my ideas today. My intention today is to give a history lesson. This history lesson focuses on the evolution of our democratic belief system from the origins of our nation right up to the present, the 21st century. As a historian, I worry a lot. I worry about our country's future. My fears are heightened by reports that Americans whose ages are only 1/2 or 1/3 my own are alienated from the political process. Confusion and misunderstanding abound concerning their grasp of the nation and their role in its self-government. From the offspring of 70s dropouts to Britney Spears wannabes today, this large segment of the American body politic is largely outside the political loop. Despite the signs of a transient patriotic fervor since 9/11, there's evidence of a growing cynicism among this X generation as far as the American dream is concerned. Who are these Exers? A year and a half ago, there was an article in the Atlantic Monthly about this very subject, the Exers, and here's a definition in just about 8 or 10 lines, just one paragraph. Who are the Exers? Exers have internalized core beliefs and characteristics that bode ill for the future of American democracy. This generation is more likely to describe itself as having a negative attitude toward America and as placing little importance on citizenship and national identity than its predecessors. And Exers exhibit a more materialistic and individualistic streak than did their parents at a similar age. Moreover, there is a general decline in social trust among the young, whether that is trust in their fellow citizens, in established institutions, or in elected officials. These tendencies are, of course, related. Heightened individualism and materialism, as Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out, tend to isolate people from one another, weakening the communal bonds that give meaning and force to notions of national identity and the common good. Well, a few words about my job. One source of pleasure in my work is the opportunity to see things differently, to examine an issue often and in depth, layer after layer, in collaboration with hundreds of students each semester, so that gradually one's perceptions become clearer, mine and hopefully theirs. Here's an illustration of what I mean. Let's call this layer number 1. A way of understanding America during our first 100 years as a nation. The first century of our new nation, beginning with George Washington in 1789, this was an era that bore the stamp of God's chosen people. That self-image, which is rooted in the 17th century Puritan mind, was reinforced by the larger-than-life strides we took in covering the American continent from sea to shining sea by 1850. This phenomenal growth was facilitated by a seemingly endless land to the west. After buying the area of the Louisiana Territory, which stretches from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains in 1803, Jefferson is reputed to have said, "We now have enough room for 1,000 generations." What did this statement by our third president mean? It meant that Americans never had to be good problem solvers, that the frontier provided a safety valve, in effect offering opportunity which otherwise would not have existed. In other words, we didn't have to be skilled at solving problems. Conveniently, our first century ended in 1890, the year that the American frontier was officially closed by the United States government. That area of a free land which had fueled the development of the nation and the American character for more than 300 years was now gone. This predicament was exacerbated by the breakneck speed with which the new industrial capitalism was radically transforming our nation from a sleepy agricultural rural society to a modern industrial system with the few rich and the many poor. I don't mean to offend anybody, but you know, this kind of reminds me of the SUV of 100 years ago up there. I don't want to lose any friends or allies here, but I just couldn't resist. You know what I mean? Were we to remove yet another layer, we would discover that the evolution of our democratic thought is related to language. If we were to dig deeper, seeking the well springs of our democratic faith, we would find that the Jeffersonian theory of democracy was rooted in 17th century England and the Puritans of the left. It was they who expounded political ideals that later became typical of radical democracy. In the thinking of these radical Puritans, the levelers and the diggers, for example, the emphasis is clearly on the side of spiritual or humane values for the common man, rather than material or economic values. So that when a revolutionary Democrat of Jefferson's generation spoke of equality, he was concerned with an essential equality of men before God, a sharing by all in the same basic humanness. When the revolutionary Democrat of Jefferson's era spoke of liberty, he spoke of freedom of conscience, moral liberty, rather than freedom of business enterprise. In short, the advocate of democracy in the Jeffersonian period believed in the right of the individual to realize his moral personality, not the right to buy and sell and prosper economically. But to complicate our picture of 17th century English democratic thought, the views held by these radical Christian Democrats were rivaled by another viewpoint held by the sober-minded middle class, people intent on shaping a theory of democracy congenial to men of property. It was John Locke who formulated this second stream of democratic thought. In his second treatise, Locke fastened onto democracy the idea that the right of private property is fundamental. In this way, Locke set in motion a materialization of democratic ideals, leading to their perversion. These two variant democratic traditions would move concurrently through the intellectual climate of the 18th century and would be taken up and used by the apologists of the American Revolution. Notice that the first of the two, the first is primarily a humane doctrine, emphasizing the worth of the individual, assigning the rights of private property to a decidedly subordinate position. The second view of democracy is not indifferent to these humane values, to be sure, but it elevates property rights to the same plane. So you can see that the democratic argument of the revolutionary period present us with an unclarified ideological pattern. The confusion that John Locke imposed at our democratic ideology has continued to the present. The gradual identification of democracy with property rights led to a dichotomous and ambivalent national attitude toward problems of social reform. Throughout the 18th and early 19th century, under the influence of growing industrialization, the prestige of property rights gradually increased. Nevertheless, the concept of human rights remained predominant until the 1870s. The 1870s marks a turning point in American democratic thought. After the peace at Appomattox, the forces of modernization kicked into high gear as the factory in the city totally altered the American landscape. That shift from a decentralized, agricultural, rural, village society to a modern industrial urban giant had occurred by 1900. This period, called by social critic Mark Twain the Gilded Age, was an era characterized by unprecedented wealth for the few and unbelievable poverty and suffering by the working class. I mentioned that the new industrial capitalism left great human suffering in its wake. Forced together in crowded tenement housing and slums, by the 1890s, American workers had lost touch with the value world they formerly inhabited. The notion of human value underwent a metamorphosis, as the standard of worth was now equated to business success. Economic philosophers like Herbert Spencer and William Graham Sumner continued to use the language of democracy, but its traditional principles, liberty, equality, freedom, democracy, those traditional principles were drained of their old meanings. Liberty, for example. Liberty came to refer now merely to material welfare as it relates to property rights. Equality. Equality will also be transmuted to support the fiction that the village storekeeper and Standard Oil Corporation operated in the economic arena on an equal playing field. Freedom. Freedom now assumed distinctly economic connotations, not altogether compatible with its more humanistic root meanings, incidentally echoed more recently in the historic civil rights marches of the 1960s. Rather, freedom of the marketplace has today achieved an almost religious sanction. Like Enron, even democracy is redefined in the lingo of the big business philosophy to mean simply that any man, if he has the right stuff, if he has luck, pluck, and virtue, any man can be rich in America. Even Jeff Skilling, former Enron CEO, walked off with $166 million, didn't he? So indeed, after 1870, property rights became sacrosanct. Godliness was said to be in league with riches. In fact, philosophers like Spencer and Sumner argued that their ideas were sanctified because they were sent by God. God, whom Spencer called the unknowable. These ideas were sent by God. So we don't question them, and we don't challenge them because they were sent by the unknowable. Incidentally, for a superb review of this transvaluation, notice the verb transvalue, for a superb book on this transvaluation of the American Democratic Creed, I would heartily recommend this book by Robert McCloskey, American Conservatism in the Age of Enterprise. which my History 102 students used to read 35 years ago here. So, in an effort to make order out of chaos, perhaps we can say that the businessman's philosophy, these men who wielded so much power, was composed of three pillars, three component parts. First of all, there was that Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism, with that ringing doctrine of laissez-faire, which of course meant no government interference, no government regulation of business enterprise whatsoever. The second element in this businessman's philosophy was seen in Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, the name of his book, the name of his philosophy, the Gospel of Wealth, where he advanced the notion of stewardship. Remember, Carnegie, the man of great wealth, said that he has some obligations to his society. He should not regard his wealth totally as a private possession, unlike Vanderbilt, who said the public be damned. No, not Carnegie. No, Carnegie said he had obligations. He would be a steward to his society. 2,500 libraries, scientific research, foundations for education. So Carnegie's a cut above Vanderbilt. But really, what Carnegie's really saying is that rich men know best what people need. Not the people themselves. That's called government. No, rich men know best what the people need. So stewardship is also an important element of this businessman's philosophy. And then I think the third element or pillar is how these ideas were, percolated down to the working class masses. You know, you can't expect those working class stiffs to be reading economic theory by Herbert Spencer or William Graham Sumner, but they are reading those corny rags to riches novels by Horatio Alger, aren't they? But not everybody bought into that philosophy. Not everybody accepted this businessman's philosophy, including, incidentally, naturalist Charles Darwin, who branded Spencer's social Darwinism as scientism, or phony science. By the 1880s and 1890s, there was a growing chorus of protest from those who felt the American dream had become a nightmare. In fact, just as Marx had predicted in his analysis of European history, the social consequences of our economic transformation were absolutely disastrous for the working class. In fact, some scholars suggested nowhere had conditions become more ripe for a Marxist revolution than in the United States, and yet it never happened. It never happened here. Why? And I think this is a great answer myself. It never happened here because, and this is really a tribute to the American genius, it didn't happen here because at this pivotal hinge in our history, the American people jumped ship. They abandoned their loyalty to 19th century notions of laissez-faire politics. They realized that the old rules no longer applied, both because of the closing of the frontier and the Industrial Revolution. And they began to realize that democracy would henceforth require their active participation through their government if it were to remain viable. And so as Americans' reliance on laissez-faire principles crumbled, other philosophers rushed forward to fill the void. William James and John Dewey would help bury the abstract assertions of social Darwinism by their more pragmatic approach. Instead of bending to the Spencerian claim that human intervention will simply screw up the economy, the pragmatic approach argued that in a democracy, people can find solutions to common problems. After decades of social paralysis induced by laissez-faire, Americans now discovered a new sense of empowerment from the pragmatist belief that citizens, that the government can serve as a vehicle to enhance people's lives. Well, let me lay on one more layer, guys and gals. As we armchair historians review the 20th century timeline on our chalkboard, we can see the aptness of Jefferson's celebrated statement, "Every generation must make its own revolution." For myself, after grappling with Jefferson for several years, I've come to understand what this cryptic statement means for us. Namely, that in a democratic society, people cannot rest on their laurels. That a healthy democracy requires the constant scrutiny by its people, so that the American dream will not fade or drift or, worse, become a nightmare. So, surveying the 20th century political landscape, we see that the American people came to reject the Marxian call for a bloody socialist revolution in favor of more peaceful evolution. Not bloody revolution outside the system, but political reform inside the system. Not revolution, but reform. That's what happened in our country. Every generation across the 20th century. Let me illustrate with some fabulous examples. There are a few people in this room who know that I love my timelines. The first generation after 1900 paused, looked in the mirror, engaged in some self-examination, and realized the social destruction during the previous Gilded Age had made a mockery of the American dream for millions of the working class. The result was the progressive reform movement, which had the effect of cleaning up America, getting America back on track, restoring the Americans' faith in Jeffersonian humanism and the common man. Note that Republicans Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft and the Democrat Woodrow Wilson were leading progressive reformers. Basic to that reform movement was the recognition that in a modern society we cannot ignore the commonweal, the well-being of society as a whole. What makes Theodore Roosevelt modern, in my judgment, was his recognition that big business, large units of production, big business isn't necessarily bad. But if big business is to be allowed, Roosevelt believed that government would be required, like an impartial referee, to ensure that all parties will benefit, not just big business. The result was an avalanche of laws. That's called government. There was an avalanche of laws designed to get America back on track again after big business had clearly gained the upper hand. Well, the progressive reform movement was halted with World War I, followed by the 1920s, which ended in October 1929 when the stock market crashed. Again, the American dream had become a nightmare for millions of citizens. Indeed, the wave of the future internationally seemed to be fascism and other forms of totalitarianism, not democracy. It didn't matter that the progressives 20 years earlier had provided solutions to their problems. Each generation must make its own revolution. For many of us, when we talk about the 1930s, we're talking about our grandparents' generation, aren't we? Or in my case, my parents' generation. They followed the lead of that wheelchair-bound candidate, Franklin Roosevelt, in choosing his New Deal to again raise up the American people. Historians today agree that the moderate reforms of the New Deal saved the nation from more radical outcomes. And like its predecessor, progressive reform, New Deal reform also ended with war, this time World War II. And then hopscotching forward to the 1960s. Now that's my generation. I remember my contemporaries as a young and noble and idealistic crowd. We recognized our common humanity. When Lyndon Baines Johnson declared his Great Society reform programs, including the war on poverty, we responded. And despite any propaganda that young people growing up during the Reagan Revolution since 1981 have heard regarding the failure of the Great Society, I must tell you that that generation made a difference and helped once again to restore the American dream, make its opportunity available to people who routinely had been ignored before. That reform movement, the Great Society, was also shipwrecked on the rocks of war, this time Vietnam. Well, as you trace the course of the 20th century, you can see the pattern that I'm referring to. When we made that basic shift from the freedom of the endless frontier to a modern industrial state, it was joined by a new recognition that each generation must affirm the humanistic principle that undergirds our democracy, that with the help of government, which after all is us, we can retain the American dream. And then, before the 1960s were over, Humpty Dumpty came tumbling down. The assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Vietnam. The disenchantment and despair that ensued fueled a giant reaction toward many things American military power, American social norms and mores. Old icons were falling, including the progressive belief that people working together, that's called government, can make a difference. That conviction was jettisoned by a defiant youth, eager to express its own identity with sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and there are many permutations during the next 30 years. Our confidence in modern youth was further eroded when we heard the results of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, which was intended to expand the meaning of democracy by lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. And yet, by the waning years of the 1990s, we learned that if 60% of 60-year-olds vote and 40% of 40-year-olds vote, only 20% of 20-year-old citizens bother to vote. So much for youthful idealism. And so, as many of our young people made that long descent into a nihilistic kind of self-absorption characterized by such puerile, preening gestures as body piercing and tattoos, and I don't mean to offend anybody here, and a pronounced apathy toward their government, if not outright alienation from it, I have wondered aloud in my lectures for the past several years if the current generation is prepared to step up to the plate and carry on the same noble Jeffersonian tradition, namely that in a democracy, every generation must do its part to keep its humanistic principles alive. Actually, I don't mean to pick on our youth. They're simply echoing the sounds they hear around them. If 62% of Americans trusted their government most of the time in 1964, 30 years later, that figure had dwindled to 19%. In recent years, political leaders, especially on the right, have found it expedient to mouth a crude, government-bashing line, including President Reagan's famous remark, "Government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem." More recently, candidate Bush said of his opponent Gore, "He trusts the government. I trust the people." No surprise that the younger generation seems deeply cynical. And then 9/11. The day that changed the world, perhaps more than did the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Waves of revulsion and incredulity have been followed by a surge of patriotism, the likes of which only older people like me can even remember. For some, it's been an occasion to revive Old Glory. Now the flag is doing double duty as diapers, as headscarves, as Britney Spears-like tops for young women, as automobile radio antenna adornments in the name of patriotism. For others, 9/11 became a channel to vent their anger by scapegoating, obviously, innocent people in our midst, even locally, even on this campus. Dire threats to Middle Eastern students, crudely delivered anonymously in campus bathrooms. Even physical assaults tainted our pristine ivory tower. And in the immediate aftermath, I heard utterances about kicking some A in Afghanistan. But thank God, there is another sentiment in the air. And nowhere was this sentiment expressed more eloquently than in this theater on September 13th. Professor Eskandari, as usual, was in the vanguard, organizing a panel audience discussion just 2 days after the bombing. 8 faculty members spoke briefly, offering their particular spins on what it all means. Then the discussion was thrown open to the packed audience of 400 plus people. For me, the most insightful testimony that day came from a young woman sitting over there. She spoke more eloquently than I could possibly paraphrase. She said something like this: "This is a wake-up call for my generation, which has not had previously a sense of direction. Now it seems clear like never before that each and every one of us is essential to our society's well-being. Now that we are part of a global village, all of us have a stake in the commonweal, the well-being of humanity as a whole." This statement took my breath away. That this generation had now been finally confronted with undeniable human suffering that could no longer be ignored, that all of us have an obligation to somehow not forget what it is that makes us human. For many, this could very well mean, by the way, a career in public service, in my opinion, the sharing of one's talents in a way that's likely to promote the commonweal. What a thrill this young woman inspired in me. After how many years of being suffused with anti-government rhetoric, again, language distortion, and vitriol about the government, the enemy, is it not possible that the current younger generation is being shaken out of its lethargy and cynicism to rally around the banner and keep alive this noble tradition in American politics, namely that in a democratic society, the people must periodically pause and look in the mirror and see whether they are remaining true to the American dream or only paying lip service to its principles through a perversion of language? This is the sacred trust that democracy thrusts on the shoulders of its citizens. And has it not been a noble tradition? Since the closing of the frontier and the end of the safety valve in 1890, Americans have acted on that Jeffersonian principle that democracy requires the active engagement of its people. Every generation must make its own revolution. And back to my fears expressed 40 minutes ago. Is the current generation of Americans up to the task to be the spear bearers, to do the heavy lifting, to help get America back on track and thereby restore the American dream. Well, you know, with us 45 minutes into the hour, I can just feel the vibrations in this room. I can tell that you're just absolutely clamoring for my spin on the future of American politics. Yes or no? Thank you. Thank you. I needed that. I needed that after 45 minutes. Actually, despite the efforts of the Reagan Revolution since 1981 to alter the linguistic paradigm, I have hope that Americans will not be manipulated by our current president's abuse of language, resorting to such lingo as the good folks or the moms and dads of America, while his public policies in a variety of ways reflect not that humanistic Jeffersonian view of democracy, but instead the other Lockean view which espouses the primacy of private property and big business, as it was in the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons, when the gap between rich and poor reached unparalleled heights, as Marx had prognosticated in Europe. Indeed, current studies indicate that this will surprise you, current studies indicate that the gap between rich and poor in the United States today is as great as it was in the 1890s when the workers were exploited at will. Those entrepreneurs enjoyed complete freedom or liberty with no government regulation at all. As I pointed out, distorted language easily segues into myths and misunderstandings. Regarding language denigration, a person would have to be at least 35 years old to remember when the word liberal was sullied during the Bush-Dukakis debate in 1988. Democratic candidate Dukakis was confronted with the question, "Are you a liberal?" And he backed off. Given my sense of history, I'm stunned to see how this honored philosophical view should be relegated so dishonestly to the list of quasi-dirty words in the American political lexicon. Result? Today, many of my students are surprised to learn that most of what they consider good about our history was because of liberalism. The vote for the common man, the ending of slavery, women's suffrage, the rights of labor and collective bargaining, the Supreme Court decision in 1954 as it affected black people particularly, environmental concerns for our children. Let there be no misunderstanding. It has always been the liberals who have encouraged and supported these ideas through history. But in the classroom, instead of awareness, I find that in every generation we encounter ignorance. These lessons are not retained. Let me give you another example of language distortion. Traditionally, the Democrats, as you probably know, have been described as irresponsible spenders in Washington, D.C. They like big government, while the Republicans have a reputation as conscientious spenders, and they like to rein in government. This is a popular conception. The facts are, however, otherwise. When Clinton left office, the federal government accounted for a smaller part of the domestic economy at any time since the 1960s. Republican partisans like to argue that Ronald Reagan actually started the decline in the size and scope of government because he popularized the idea. Yet it was Democratic President Clinton who brought it to realization. Ronald Reagan may have denounced the welfare system, but it was Clinton who signed the bill fundamentally altering the welfare system. Reagan called for smaller government. Clinton delivered it. Facts. More on such myths and reality. In a 24-year span prior to current President Bush, both Republicans and Democrats each had 12 years in presidential office. During the 12 years of Republican rule, they spent 22% more than the government brought in, whereas Democratic presidential deficits averaged less than 7%. Clinton began with a GOP-level 22% deficit, but after 5 years, the budget went into surplus for the first time since 1969 and stayed in the black. His final budget carried a 12% surplus. Having now exposed widespread myths about Republicans and Democrats and the Clinton administration, what about his successor, our current president? Despite his friendly, folksy Texas lingo, President Bush's policies certainly do not seem geared to the needs of the commonweal. For example, take big issues like the environment and tax reform. Look at his environmental proposals. He's shifting cleanup costs from the polluters to the people themselves. Before this, those who caused the mess would clean it up. He wants to shift that responsibility. He has weakened EPA rules, causing a top official in his own EPA to resign in protest. There's less protection for the wetlands, more protection for miners and developers in his plan, more roads and more power lines on public lands. And we learned recently that, yes, the ban on snowmobiles in the national parks was delayed. And the proposal for oil drilling in the Arctic goes on. What about our compassionate conservatives' posture on tax reform? Well, in Bush's program, here we go, watch. Dr. Grunt, thank you. I did it. In Bush's program, check this out. You don't need to do Statistics 117 for this. 40% of the tax relief in Bush's program, 40% of those monies go to the top 1%, which means the corporations. Medicare, which is a system that keeps millions of people from medical destitution, Bush is going to take out more than $500 billion from Medicare to fund this tax break for the top 1%. At the same time, 1/3 of the poor are children, and poverty programs are being cut. But let me be clear. It's not absolute equality that society requires, but it does need a sense of equity. Even Adam Smith, the prophet of laissez-faire economics, had a strong concern for equity, if not equality. Listen to Adam Smith. No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity besides that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of people should have such a share of the produce of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. Notice how readily such issues segue into matters of international concern, as the world has shrunk to a global village, where myths and misunderstandings about our role in the world abound. For example, we Americans like to think of ourselves as generous, yet the facts indicate that in the share of GNP given in foreign aid by advanced countries, the United States ranks dead last, well behind far poorer countries such as Portugal and Greece. I wish President Bush would use the bully pulpit to inform Americans of the difference between our generous self-image and the less attractive reality, namely that the United States is the Scrooge of the Western world. Indeed, Britain, France, and other European countries have been pushing plans to boost aid from the world's wealthiest nations to poor countries and regions, but the Bush administration has blocked these proposals. As an historian, as an historian, I hope that President Bush will be able to transcend his political training and experience and tone down his swashbuckling adventurism on the international stage. I wish he'd begin to fashion himself after General George C. Marshall instead of General George Patton. I must say that I had to grimace the other day when I heard the president intone, and these are his words, "When I speak to the world." If such words arouse hostility from his domestic rivals, it does not take a rocket scientist to understand how his utterances and actions have elicited strong opposition not only from the Palestinian camps, not only from the entire Arab world, but even from among our traditional European allies. If the 20th century has been labeled the American century by Henry B. Luce, there is deep fear among our global critics that American foreign policy ventures since the end of the Cold War are creating another image of our country in the 21st century, namely America's imperial century. How do we wish to be regarded by the rest of the global village? In the last year, America's image elsewhere is perceived as pronouncedly brash, arrogant, omnipotent, omniscient, voracious in appetite for natural resources, newly ambitious Fortress America mentality buttressed by unnumbered billions of dollars to protect us here in the homeland, blatant rejection of international agreements painstakingly arrived at over decades involving both the environment and the use of nuclear weapons. Bush's swagger on both of these issues worries our friends. This go-it-alone behavior is joined by the clear expectation that others will fall into line. Will such an image, will this message win over the hearts and minds of other village inhabitants? At a time when the planet is shrinking, even Palestinians in the camp see our world on black and white TV. The United States is not seen as a partner concerned about the common weal, the well-being of humanity as a whole. Never has the third world taken greater umbrage at the notion prevalent throughout the 20th century, the notion of American exceptionalism. Exceptionalism. We're different. We're special. We're God's chosen people. Parenthetically, have you noticed that there's only one politician on the scene these days who has refused to end his speeches with the mantra, "God bless America"? And it's John McCain. But okay, let's talk religion, despite separation of church and state. Peace on earth. Jesus Christ preached peace on earth. But the vexing question for us in the new millennium is whether our children can be raised outside the village. Or to say it in another way, in a global village, can there be peace without justice? Are we prepared to recognize our common humanity with others in the village? Including, for example, tiny example, some kind of equity in the use of oil. Just last week, Senator Trent Lott led the fight to defeat higher fuel efficiency standards, keeping the SUV industry in mind. Senator Lott argued that such a law would hurt business. He said, quote, "That's what it means to be American." Well, his comments reflect the Lockean perspective on the American way, doesn't it? This is how the New York Times recently editorialized about the use of American power. This is 2 Sundays 2 Sundays ago. This is the New York Times editorial on the use of American power. One paragraph. The most effective way to make other countries comfortable with American military power is to demonstrate that the United States has their best interests at heart, too. They will not be impressed by the offer of a kind of Pax Americana in which Washington makes the world safe for everyone on its own terms. The United States must buy into the goals that its allies and potential allies have already identified as important. That includes making inroads against poverty, infectious disease, and malnourishment around the globe, undermining dictatorships with education and development, and curbing both the spread of horrific unconventional weapons and the dangers of global warming. Well, perhaps there will be a swing back to the center. President Clinton did his best to bring us back to a rational, vital center. Although the forces of Lockean conservatism seem to have gained the upper hand, indeed more so today under President Bush than under Ronald Reagan. The careful student of American history knows that despite these mood swings, to the right or to the left, it seems as if we're always brought back to our senses, to the vital center. In fact, no one has explained this better than E.J. Dionne, Jr., a writer and columnist, brilliant writer for the Washington Post, in his book entitled, "They Only Look Dead: Why Progressives Will Dominate the Next Political Era." For example, in a way, President Clinton exemplifies the progressive tradition, which does not mean, by the way, big government. Everybody thinks it means big government. In fact, listen to this. Under adverse conditions, Clinton shrank government, shrank the deficit, while making government better. This is no time for humor, Frank. Frank, this is serious business here. Here's my spin on President Bush and whether he'll make it to Mount Rushmore. If he can declare his independence from his right wing and stake out the vital center as did his predecessor, he could be elected to a second term. And if, these are big ifs, if his handlers and advisors could contain his innate exuberance for Lockean conservatism, he could earn a Nobel Prize. Is he going to do it? Well, in the meantime, since the clock is now running out, all I have to offer you, not even food for thought, just a few tidbits before we retire to the veranda for the gin and tonics or whatever they're serving today. First of all, I would like to share with you, Lincoln's definition of government. A Republican. I love this definition of government. The purpose of government is to do for the people what they cannot do at all or cannot do so well for themselves in their separate or individual capacities. And I'd also like to offer you a few aphorisms. For example, I think this is a good aphorism. Think globally, but act locally. Oh my gosh, there's so much work to be done, isn't there? Each of us needs to be proactive in the new millennium. And the greatest mind of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, he said, we must begin to think differently. In this connection, I think of the great Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian who lived a long time ago. He probably died about 1950 at an old age. Toynbee was no ordinary historian who wrote about what happened last year or 50 years ago or 200 years ago. No, Toynbee wrote about whole civilizations, the rise, decline, and fall of whole civilizations. You know, the Egyptian civilization and the Babylon, all those civilizations. And Toynbee tells us that of 21 great civilizations, 19 of them perished from internal causation, internal disease, not military conquest from the outside. And isn't that the way we've been trained to think? Isn't that the way we've been trained to think? Certainly since World War II, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And what about the Cold War? And what about the bomb shelters that we remember from the 1950s? And the atomic bomb drills in elementary school. We were always trained to believe that the threat is an external threat, and yet Toynbee tells us that 19 of 21 perished from internal causation. Perhaps we need to begin thinking differently. So what Toynbee is really saying is that civilizations go down the drain when people no longer care. When people no longer care. That's the red flag. That's when civilizations go down. Oh, what can I do anyway? Oh, my instructor, he is so corny. He wants us to write our congressman. This guy's out in left field. Oh, let's go get a keg. Huh? People give up. And they're misinformed. And they're unaware. And they're self-righteous. And they're ignorant. Is it possible that humanity's survival in the 21st century will require of us, for our children's sake, is it possible that the 21st century will require from us the implementation of the doctrine of sustainability? Is that the new word for the 21st century? If you take something out, you got to put it back or you're going to run out. People must begin to think differently. Is the American mindset prepared to support policies which promote survival and equity in the global village? And finally, since we're loving aphorisms today, this is Professor Bagish's favorite aphorism. He's been raving about this for the 37 years I've known. Is that right, Henry? It's one of your favorites. I have seen the enemy, and it is us. We've got to stop blaming others. I see this as the beauty and tragedy of democracy. The beauty and tragedy of democracy is either that we create our own future or we become our own victims. But if we don't do it in a democracy, it won't be done. Well, thank you very much.